everyone, so this lesson is on microstructures of the brain. We have already reviewed the nervous system, the brain, and biological neural networks, and today we're diving deep into the anatomy of the neuron itself. Just a quick disclaimer, this lesson has a lot of vocab words, so odds are if I bring up a new vocab word, I'm going to define it within the next few minutes, so just hang in there. Alright, so what we know, the brain communicates through different circuits and systems that allow us to interpret and manipulate our environment. And pathways that take information to the brain are called afferent pathways, and pathways that take information from the brain are called efferent pathways. So our questions for today are: what are neurons, what are glial cells, and through what specialized structures do neurons accomplish important functions? The neuron is just the name given to the cells that make up the nervous system. They run from your brain through your spinal cord and all throughout your body in complex networks and pathways. Though they share some characteristics with regular body cells, they also have their own specialized structures that allow them to accomplish their function, which is to receive and conduct messages throughout the body. Neurons can be inhibitory, meaning they shut off neural signals, excitatory, meaning they pass on neural signals, or they can contribute to neuromodulation, meaning that they influence some part of the neurotransmission process. So this is an image of the classic neuron. You'll probably see it a lot, but you can see the cell body, the axon, the dendrites, and the synapses form receptive, conducting, and secretory regions that allow for neurotransmission to occur. Something that I've found in my study of neuroscience so far is that a lot of structures have names and then they have extra fancy names. So dendrites and axons are referred to as neurites or neuronal processes at times, and it just basically means any extension from the cell body. So first we're going to talk about the cell body, which has the fancy name, the soma. And it's responsible for synthesis of proteins and other material needed to keep the cell healthy and functioning. And it's typically part of the receptive part of the neuron, meaning it can receive information from other neurons. The cell body also contains organelles that are typical of other cells. So here are a quick review of essential organelles. If you've ever taken biology, you probably know most of these, but the cytosol is less of an organelle, and it's more of it's just the fluid that fills the soma. And in the neuron, it's very rich in potassium. It'll make sense why that's important later. Of course, like all other cells in the body, the neuron is powered by ATP, and you probably didn't have to take biology to know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So there you go. And next we have the endoplasmic reticulum. In the neuron, of course, there is both the smooth and the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and it is responsible for developing proteins. And this is super important because many neurotransmitters are proteins. So the endoplasmic reticulum in neurons is actually highly developed. Next we have the Golgi apparatus. Once proteins have been synthesized, they have to be processed and packaged in order to go where they need to go. And in the case of the neuron, these packages are called synaptic vesicles. These are just the storage containers for neurotransmitters before they're released into the synapse. Of course, the neuron needs a nucleus. The nucleus holds all of the genetic material of the cell. It's the site of transcription in protein synthesis, which can be influenced by other neurotransmitters. And finally, the cytoskeleton is a network of filaments and microtubules that provide structure for the cell and allow for transport of materials from the cell body to the axon terminal. So here we just have a nice picture of the soma. You can see all of the different organelles, and something I just want you to notice in particular in this image is the way that the microtubules extend down the axon, and that is important for something called axoplasmic transport. But first, let's define the axon. So the axon extends away from the cell body, and it conducts signals away from the cell body and towards a receiving neuron. There are three regions of the axon, known as the axon hillock, the axon collateral, and the axon terminal. The axon hillock is the region of the axon that is closest to the soma, and it is the origin point of the action potential. The action potential then passes down the axon collateral and finally reaches the axon terminal. which holds synaptic vesicles ready to release neurotransmitters into the synapse. And yes, these neurotransmitters either inhibit or pass along the signal to the next neuron. So here is another fancy name that you need to know. The plasma membrane on the axon is given its own name because of its importance in signal conduction. It's embedded with special channels and pumps that play a role in the conduction of the action potential down the axon collateral. So just when you zoom in, you can see there are proteins, there are things inside the axon, there are things outside the axon, and the exchange of these things is ultimately what the action potential is. But we'll go really far into depth in section 3. And we'll also talk about what this little section is right here. So another important concept to understand with the axon is axoplasmic transport. So as mentioned before, microtubules run along the axon collateral for transport of materials to the synaptic terminals and from the terminals to the soma. There are no microtubules in the synaptic terminal, and the transport is achieved through use of motor proteins called dynein and kinesin. Breakdown or disruption of axoplasmic transport can cause degradation of a neuron and is indicated in some neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's. So this fun little image shows a synaptic vesicle being carried by an actin filament down the microtubule in an axon. So finally we have the dendrites. The dendrites branch from the soma. They carry signals from other neurons to the cell body. In other words, this is the receiving neurite. The area in which the dendrites span is referred to as the dendritic field. The ends of the dendrites contain different receptor proteins that bind neurotransmitters when they are released by the axon terminals of other neurons. So next we have the synapse. The synapse is just the area between the site of neurotransmitter release and the site of neurotransmitter reception. The membrane from which the neurotransmitters are released is referred to as the presynaptic membrane. The membrane from which the neurotransmitter is received is referred to as the postsynaptic membrane. As you can see in this image, the neuron can also be called, okay, so this neuron is presynaptic to this neuron, but this neuron is presynaptic to a neuron that's over here. So when we're defining presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons or presynaptic and postsynaptic membranes, it's just in regards to whatever synapse we're talking about. So in this case, we would be talking about this synapse, and this axon terminal would form the presynaptic membrane, and it looks like the soma would form the postsynaptic membrane. And there are different types of synapses, and these are axosomatic, axodendritic, and axonic synapses. The names are based on the postsynaptic membrane. And so for axosomatic synapses, the postmembrane is the soma. Axodendritic, it is the dendrites, and axoaxonic, this is the axon itself. So axodendritic and axosomatic are the most common. Axoaxonic synapses are most likely involved in neuromodulation, which is just a modification of the steps in which neurotransmission occurs. And so you won't see axoaxonic synapses very often, but they are still there. Here is just a fun little preview of what happens at the synapse. So you can faintly see these little circles. These are the synaptic vesicles, and they hold neurotransmitters. The light represents the action potential, and when the action potential reaches the terminal, the neurotransmitters are released from the presynaptic membrane, and they bind on the postsynaptic membrane, causing an action potential. So next we're going to take a step back and talk about glial cells, and these are other cells in the nervous system that act as a support system. So oligodendrocytes are pictured in blue, and they synthesize a substance called myelin, which insulates the neurons and is essential to efficient conduction of the action potential along the axon. The myelin is present in segments with a small gap between them called the node of Ranvier. I will talk more about the importance of myelin on the next slide. The microglia are the immune cells of the central nervous system, and they're responsible for removal of damaged cells and synapses. Astrocytes are the most abundant glial cells and are often referred to as star-shaped. They provide structural support as well as biochemical support through connecting neurons with blood vessels. Astrocytes also produce cytokines and growth factors, which control the formation, maturation, and function of synapses as a whole. They have a role in the reuptake process for neurotransmitters as well, which is very important. Ependymal cells, which is not in this picture, is the name given to the lining in the cavities of the nervous system that holds cerebrospinal fluid. So there's our ependymal cells, but this also gives us a closer look at the other cells. So the segmented characteristic of the myelin sheath allows for saltatory conduction of the action potential. Saltatory conduction means that instead of the action potential moving slowly down the whole axon, it quickly jumps from node to node, ultimately arriving at the axon terminal sooner than if it was unmyelinated. Breakdown of the myelin sheath is associated with diseases such as multiple sclerosis, in which the action potential never reaches the terminal because saltatory conduction does not occur, and this ultimately causes miscommunication in the brain and the nervous system and breakdown. And then another role of astrocytes that was not pictured on the previous slide and is demonstrated here, you can see is it covers the node of Ranvier when an axon is being myelinated to prevent overmyelination. Of course, if there's too much insulator, then the action potential can't conduct at all. So that's very important. And it more clearly pictures the astrocytes' connections to a blood vessel so that you can, see how it would supply nutrients to the neuron. And finally, we have the ependymal cells, which take in oxygen, vitamins, and glucose from the capillaries and secretes cerebrospinal fluid. So those are just some other cells in the nervous system that support neurons, and we'll go back to neurons. So here are some whole neuron structure types, and some of them I know look a little weird, but that is okay. So unipolar, they look like little aliens to me. Unipolar neurons contain a neurite that is an axon. The neurites can be characterized as proximal or distal, with the end usually being a sensory receptor. Next we have bipolar neurons, which have two neurites, one axon, and one fused dendrite. The bipolar cells are often sensory receptors. They also have sensory receptors in a similar manner to unipolar neurons. And finally, we have multipolar neurons. These are my favorite, and they contain many neurites. They have lots of dendrites and one axon, and they're the most common form of neuron and often the most recognizable. So now that we've categorized neurons based on structure, we can also categorize them based on function. So there are three main types of neurons, including sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons form afferent pathways that transmit signals from sensory receptors and organs to the brain. As you can see in the image, sensory neurons have specialized endings, including encapsulated and free nerve endings. All bipolar neurons and most unipolar neurons are sensory neurons. Motor neurons are at the neuromuscular junction, and they form efferent pathways. Their axons interact with the muscle to cause movement. And the neuromuscular junction is just the special name for the synapse between the axon and the sarcomere of a muscle. Interneurons can be afferent or efferent, and they are just the connections between neurons. So a neuron that is connected to two or more other neurons is an interneuron, and they can be afferent or efferent. So kind of putting that all together, sensory neurons take in information that is then passed through interneurons to the brain. The signal is interpreted in the brain, and then the brain sends efferent signals, sometimes to motor neurons, which carry out interpretation of the signals. So we had a lot of material there, but a quick summary. The neuron is the main functional unit of the nervous system and is responsible for carrying neural signals. This is achieved through reception of a signal at the dendrites, conduction of the signal through the axon, and release of neurotransmitters at the synapse. We are starting a new section next time in understanding the signal that passes through the axon, which is the action potential. See you next time.